The Silver Shrew, written and narrated by Wergath. Verena Tholstone, a young girl of 8 when her life changed, lived with her parents in the unremarkable town of Shamborough. Before her 8th birthday, however, she played in the streets with some of the other girls and flung mud at the boys when she could, as they were always getting into trouble. When she wasn't playing, she was learning how to cook and sew from her mother. But unlike many of the girls her age, learned to read and write from a priestess in the local church. It gave her a great advantage over her peers and eventually gave her access to some of the town's hidden secrets. Learning to read and write had sparked her inquisitive mind to try and understand the many symbols left on various surfaces throughout town. It didn't take her all too long to figure out their meaning, and no sooner had she done so than she got in trouble. Or rather, her mother did. At that stage, it was a mere warning that she shouldn't meddle. 5 weeks later, however, armed men stood at her door telling Verena's mother to make Verena stop, or else. Verena's mother, of course, was shocked and promised that it would not ever happen again. In fact, she swore it. Unfortunately for her mother, Verena didn't stop. Her love for mystery was too great, so great in fact that as a present to herself on her 8th birthday, she wrote down the code and used this lexicon of mystery to carve a message on the fence outside her home which said, "Queen for the day, free for all time." Later, her birthday was celebrated with Serenbe bunny cookies and a silver shrew hanging from a necklace. Verena couldn't be happier and ran through the house for most of the afternoon singing about her mother and father and the greatest gift in the world. So naturally, that night, she slept like a bear in hibernation. That same night, the guardsman came into Verena's home, slammed the door, and took her mother prisoner. The charge was treason and espionage through her daughter. Verena, being a child, was found innocent. Not even when she screamed through the court explaining everything would the court change its verdict. No, Verena's mother was a traitor and a spy now, and nothing could change it. The usual sentence in these cases was death by hanging, but since Verena's mother was the wife of an uncommonly skilled blacksmith, she was exiled to live in the forest instead. Verena acted out, thoroughly outraged by her mother's exile and the judge's prohibition to seek her out. Her father, who had chosen not to speak against the court out of fear, told her several times to abandon her behavior. But Verena wouldn't hear of it. Verena continued to act out and soon got mixed up with the wrong kinds of people, stealing and manipulating to get by. Several years later, on the night of her 16th birthday, her father put a bundle on the table and went to bed, never to wake. This to Verena was a sign that she had to look for her mother in the nearby forest, whatever the consequence. And mere weeks later, she did leave the town of Shamborough, only to find a note hanging from a half-rotten door to a cabin near the river, deep inside the forest. The note read, "Mara Tholstone, exile of Shamborough, and inhabitant of this cabin, is hereby summoned to Blightward in service of our great king, Yonoran Hawklight." "In service to our great king?" Verena snickered, as if she needed more reasons to rob his royal bum blind. Well, she thought, if fate wanted her to empty the royal treasury into her own pockets, she wasn't gonna argue. In fact, she would do it with nothing less than absolute glee, if only to spite the man who had nerve and saw fit to summon her mother to the city of lies and false facades. Verena fastened her bootstraps again and ran for Blightward. During the 4-week journey, she stopped only once for food and a long rest, at the Fiery Fay Inn. While she was sitting there, alone, at a table, she noticed a small group of travelers, obviously thieves, sitting at the table near the back entrance, no doubt waiting for a full inn and a quick haul. Verena smiled to herself, finished her dinner, and stood up. The band of thieves looked at her, and she at them, winking at the young packed-born girl of the band. and she walked towards them, picking pockets along the way. The pack-born girl and her friends looked at Verena with mixed awe and anger as she sat at their table, smiling heartily as she did. Verena looked them each in the eye, set down the bag with newly stolen coin, and asked pleasantly for their names. The pack-born girl answered first. Stragdaval is my name, and you have some nerve. Stealing more, and more skillfully than you, giving you the coin I took. Oh yes, that takes nerve, Verena interrupted. Hey! The youngest human boy cried. Verena laughed despite herself. In love, are we? How adorable! The boy blushed with feigned anger and obvious shame. What's your name, boy? Verena asked quickly. Andon, the boy answered. Verena smiled and nodded, settling finally on the face of the oldest human boy. How about you, then? Do you have a name? Verena asked. The boy stared at her blankly and said not a word, to which Verena's smile grew with obvious glee before she asked again. But again the boy did not answer. Very well, then, Verena said. I will call you Silent Shadow when we speak, for lack of a better name. The boy raised his head slightly, then nodded, annoyed at her. Verena clapped her hands together once, and, in exchange for their company, trust, and loyalty, told the younglings all she had learned about thievery. Impressed by her skill, they agreed eagerly and accompanied her to Blightward the next day at noon, so Verena could take care of something important before their next job. 2.5 weeks later, after arriving in Blightward, Verena left her band of comrades at the Tearful Traveller Inn and asked the local court for an audience with the king. But when the king got word of the reason, he sent back a letter denying her audience and explaining that Mora Tholstone was no longer in his service. It went on to explain that she was now keeper of books and scrolls at the Blightward Library. After reading this, Verena ran as quickly as she could to the library and asked for Mora Tholstone. The woman behind the clerk's desk paused for a moment, tapped the desk nervously, and finally concluded that Mora's probably on the second floor. But don't run, please. Verena took a few nervous breaths, nodded thankfully at the woman, and walked cautiously up to the second floor, where she called out softly for her mother. A few agonizing seconds later, a frail old woman stepped out from among 2 rows of books. She wore spectacles now, but didn't look less happy for it. Slightly confused, her eyes settled on Verena, and she smiled. Yes, dear? Mora said cheerfully. Can I help you with something? Verena was crushed in realizing that her mother hadn't recognized her and took a desperate step closer, hoping, beyond hope, that she would recognize her. You know, Mara said suddenly, I have a daughter who would be about your age now. In fact, you kind of look like her. She lives in Shamborough, not far from here. Probably married to a gorgeous bard or something. She loves to read, you see. Verena smiled with tears in her eyes. I'm afraid I'm still single, she said in a half-sob. Mora peered at Verena for a long while, touched her face probingly, and asked, Verena, is that really you? Verena smiled and cried simultaneously, then nodded. My baby! Mora exclaimed, holding Verena tight. Oh, my darling Silver Shrew, how I missed you, she added. Verena and her mother talked for hours after, catching up on 12 years' worth of everything they'd seen and done, until the library closed. But even when it did, they talked in Mora's home until the lanterns in the streets were lit. When Verena finally left for the night to take up her room in the Tearful Traveller Inn, Mora told her something about an underground sanctum built by followers of an old god. Grateful, Verena hugged her mother one last time and returned to her band of comrades who had, in the meantime, taken to the town's riches enough to relieve it of a fair amount. Stragdaval, the beaming female pact-born leader of this endeavor, explained what they had gathered in information and how they'd pulled it off. Verena, feeling both proud and bothered, found no words for either emotion and smiled slightly. The silence was so thick Stragdaval half expected Verena to throw a dagger, but when none came, she asked for Verena's opinion. Much to Stragdaval's surprise, however, Verena hugged her quickly to let her know how she felt. But just when Stragdaval would have asked Verena what this meant, Silent Shadow suddenly spoke. "So, what's your name?" he asked. Verena, startled by the fact that Silent Shadow had just spoken, and by the question, asked, "What?" Silent Shadow looked at Verena angrily and repeated his question, clenching his fist on what could only be a dagger. Verena sighed and stared at him, annoyed, just as he had done some time before. Recognizing what Verena had just done, Silent Shadow smiled slyly, then said, "Very well then. I will call you Silver Shrew when we speak, after that creature around your neck, for lack of a better name." Verena raised her head slyly, then nodded with mock annoyance, and smiled heartily at him. "I have the perfect gift for you, then," Silent Shadow added. "Bought it from the local smith." Verena looked at Silent Shadow intently as he put a small bundle on the table and nodded at her. Unable to hide her excitement, Verena opened the package impatiently to reveal a mask in silver, shaped like the face of a shrew. She picked it up and inspected the finely crafted Phoenician-style mask, taking in the many details of the shrew's nose, snout, and eyes, then put it on. The second the mask was completely on, something inside her just clicked. She thought of the underground sanctum her mother had mentioned, and envisioned it as an underground lair for her thieves to live and hide in. Her eyes lit up at the thought in a literal sense, as latent innate magic boiled up inside her and made her eyes shine a bright sapphire blue. Stragdaval observed the strange scene with great alarm and shook Verena, all the while asking her, "What's going on?" Eventually Verena came back to herself and said she'd had an idea. Silent Shadow and Andon leaned in closer in anticipation, much like other children might do for a bedtime story. Verena smiled and stroked the shrew's mask suggestively and said, "The Fair Felon Sanctuary." The others laughed for a while, then sighed as if realizing she was serious, and fired off a lot of questions, all of which Verena answered by sharing her plans. Andon was so excited by this, he jumped in with an idea of his own. He suggested to create a network of thieves and spies in a sort of guild they could call the Fair Felon Guild. A couple of ideas several other people had, and a good 7 years later, the Fair Felon Guild was born, and had its heart in the Fair Felon Sanctuary, which was also known as the Keep Under the City to associates. It was grown to connect to the Order of the Silver Loom and even the king himself. Verena herself, now known only as the Silver Shrew to the outside world, not as much as a thief, but as a demonic leader of the Fair Felon Guild whose glowing sapphire eyes peer through a silver mask as her rapier runs you through, had her right-hand woman Stragdaval, formed as a connection to an old god through her dedication to the rapier, and her destiny as speculated by the Magi of the Silver Loom, which was to find the Dragonstone. Since the night of the vile mist, however, a third eye had appeared in the center of her right palm, which she protects with an enchanted glove. She can use this eye to read a person's mind, but not without cost. The eye is known as the Evil Eye and linked to an unknown entity as well as her. It's considered to be necromantic in nature. Silent Shadow since grew to become the guild's assassin, deployed only when the guild is sure the target is a threat to the commoners of Blightwood. Andon, however, disappeared some time after the vile mist, with a cat he was known to carry. Some believe he's dead, though rumor combined with sightings of his ex-pet lead the guild to believe the rumors are true. That is to say, turned into a four-armed abomination by the mist. Mara Tholston, mother to her darling daughter Verena and the infamous Silver Shrew, currently enjoys her retirement and holds a tiny statuette bearing the likeness of her late husband. The statuette, a gift from her daughter as a memento. Because of Mara's inability to travel and Verena's determination to keep her mother happy, Mara still does not know her husband is dead.